Port Credit, the jewel in the crown of Mississauga, has been a center for commerce and an attraction for visitors for hundreds of years. Archaeological evidence suggests that Iroquoian and Algonquian-speaking peoples were attracted to the Credit River Valley over thousands of years. By 1700, an Ojibwa group known as the Mississauga had driven the Iroquois from the north shore of Lake Ontario. In the 1720s, the French had established many trading posts around Lake Ontario, one of which was located near the mouth of the Credit River, a name derived from the custom of allowing native peoples to trade on credit. After the decline of French control in the region, the British continued to trade with the native Mississaugas. In 1805, the British signed a land treaty, 13A, with the Mississaugas. The Mississaugas retained 1 mile strip on each side of the Credit River from Cranberry Cove, now Bruckner Rhododendron Gardens, to Hiawatha Park. Settlement of Toronto Township began in earnest after 1805, and August 2, 2005, marked the 200th anniversary of this treaty signing. In 1818 and 1820, additional treaties were signed between the Crown and the Mississauga, which opened up the 1 mile strip on either side of the Credit River to settlement. The Port Credit Harbor Company was formed in 1834 for the construction of the harbor, and the village of Port Credit was surveyed on the west bank in 1835. When the Mississaugas relocated to the new Credit Reserve in 1847, the Credit River was open to commercial expansion.
So the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and I'll use the abbreviation MCFN, are the descendants of what were known as the River Credit Mississaugas. It's interesting because they are not named after the Credit River. The Credit River is named after them. The Mississaugas, when they first were in this part of the world, dealt with the French fur traders, and they would trade at the posts. There was a French post at the mouth of the Credit River, and the French traders found that the Mississaugas were trustworthy Indians and that they were credit worthy. So they could advance them trade goods, muskets, traps, and food and provisions. And they would go off to their trap lines in the winter and come back in the spring and sell their furs and repay their debts. Hence, so they really should be called the good credit Indians or the credit-worthy Indians, but that's where the Mississaugas of the Credit name comes from, and that's why it's called the Credit River. The British Crown recognized the Mississaugas as the only Indians with title to what is now most of the GTA, or the Greater Toronto Area. So treaties 22 and 23, that's what we're talking about. And these two treaties took place in 1820. And it resulted in the River Credit ceding the last of their lands to the Crown at 12 Mile Creek, which is Bronte, 16 Mile Creek, Oakville, and the Credit River, Port Credit. So again, map's worth 1,000 words. Here we go. So I've been working with the Mississaugas of the Credit for a long time, and these two treaties just totally mystified me. I could not understand it because this was the last land that they owned on this planet. They had no other place to go. They had no other place to live. These were very important rivers that they needed to feed themselves and their families. Why on earth would they surrender these last little bits of their land to the Crown and leave themselves with no place to live? Well, and the answer is simple. They didn't. What their ancestors thought they were doing, and because the Crown told them that this is what they were doing, was placing the lands into the hands of His Majesty to hold in trust for them so they could live there unmolested forever. So we've got some nice quotes here. And Chief Joseph Sawyer was one of the chiefs at the time of the Treaty 22 in 1820. And he spoke several years after the treaty, but it's about 5 years after the treaty, I think. So it's when he says several years ago, he's not talking about something that was 100 years ago, it's something that happened in his lifetime, in his recent memory. So this is a quote from Chief Joseph Sawyer. And he said, "Several years ago, we owned the land on the 12-mile creek, the 16, and the Credit. On these, we had good hunting and fishing, and we did not mean to sell the land, but to keep it for our children forever." Our great father, Colonel Claus, who was the British representative at Treaty 22, went to us and said, "The white people are getting thick around you, and we are afraid that they or the Yankees will cheat you out of your land." And he went on to say that Colonel Claus had said, he was the deputy superintendent of Indian Affairs. He said, "You had better put it into the hands of your very great father, the king, to keep for you till you want to settle, and he will appropriate it for your good." Still a quote from Chief Sawyer. He says, "Some of these words were thought good, but we did not like to give up all our lands, as some were afraid that our great father would keep our land. But our great father had always had great confidence in him, so we said, yes, keep our lands for us." And of course, what happened instead was the Crown took the lands and sold them all to settlers between 1820 and 1847. There's a long story to that and why and how it happened. And to tie it up with Oakville, it was in 1827, Colonel William Chisholm purchased land at the mouth of 16 Mile Creek and started building what is now Oakville. So only 7 years after the treaty, the lands at Bronte, I believe, had already been sold off. Oakville was being sold off by 1827, only 7 years after the treaty. And why on earth this happened? What happened? We have to remember a couple of things. In 1820, the Mississaugas were still not sedentary. They were still living off the chase. They pursued game and they traveled with the seasons. They didn't have houses. They didn't have homes. They were not settled anywhere. So these were places that these three river mouths that they wanted to keep, where they could camp, spend the winter or the summers and fish. And what they thought they were doing was placing this land into the hands of the crown, and that the crown would keep these lands and that they would take care of them there. This was an unusual treaty. Treaty 22 was actually the first surrender in trust to Her Majesty to happen in the history of Canada. It was the first real establishment of what we believe was an Indian reserve, or what came to be an Indian reserve under the Indian Act when it was finally created. And when Reverend Peter Jones took over, and there's a lot of people think that at the time the British thought that the Mississaugas would simply die out. They were having a lot of trouble. They had problems with alcohol and disease, and I think the British just thought they would die off and they'd go away and they wouldn't have to worry about them. But Reverend Peter Jones took over the leadership of the First Nation, and he established the first permanent residence of the Mississaugas at what is now the Mississauga Golf and Country Club. I don't know what it is about Indians and golf courses. We think of Oka, and there seem to be many disputes that involve First Nations and golf courses. But they built a really nice village, an excellent village on the banks of the Credit River, cleared a bunch of land. They had excellent houses. They had barns. They were haying. They had animals. It was a model community. People used to come from miles around to see it and see what, they were amazed what the First Nations were doing and how they were very successful farmers. But they kept asking around for the deeds to their land, because they realized that they didn't own the land, that they'd surrendered the land to, or given the land to His Majesty. And they'd seen His Majesty sell off the majority of Treaty 22 lands, and they were very worried that the Crown would sell the land out from underneath their feet, including the land that they had made their improvements on. And Reverend Peter Jones actually traveled all the way to England to meet with Queen Victoria, and he left with what he thought was an assurance from her that they were secure in their village on the River Credit, but it was not to be. A gentleman, there's two streets just down from where I live in Oakville. I should point out to you that I live on Treaty 22, so I'm very interested in this. There's a street, Bond Street and Head Street, and it was Sir Bond Head who was the head of the Upper Canada at this time, and he didn't think much of Indians, and he wanted them to remove from all of the civilized parts of Ontario, and he wanted the Mississaugas out of there. He wanted the land at the River Credit for white settlers, and he flat out refused to give them title to their village. The Mississaugas had surrendered millions and millions of acres of land to the Crown. The Crown did not offer them any land in return. They originally thought that they might go up to the Owen Sound area and settle up there, and they actually went up and checked it out. And if you know Owen Sound, it's not the best farmland in the world, and these guys were farmers. And they said, no, that's not going to work. And in 1847, they were sort of at their wits' end, and their ancient enemies said to them, well, we have land here at the Grand River that you gave to the Crown to give to us. We're happy to give a portion of it back to you. And they did. And they gave them a piece of land near Hagersville on the southwestern corner of the Six Nations Reserve. And that became the new credit reserve. And when they relocated from Port Credit to Hagersville, they called the area the New Credit. And they settled again upon what was part originally of the Between the Lakes Treaty and the Haldeman deed that had been granted to Joseph Brant. So looking at all of this and doing the research on all of this, we've prepared land claims and given them to Canada and to the province of Ontario. We've not gone to court yet. We're trying to do this through their claims process as an out-of-court resolution. And what we're saying basically is that when the Mississaugas placed these lands into the hands of the Crown, they did so in trust. They never surrendered the land to the Crown for sale. They didn't understand that the Crown was going to sell these lands. They thought the Crown was going to hold these lands for them. And when there's a piece of land that's owned by Her Majesty and set aside for the use and benefit of a First Nation, that is the textbook definition of an Indian reserve. So we believe that the parcels at Bronte, Oakville, and Port Credit are still reserve lands today, that the Mississaugas have never surrendered them for sale, and that they're owed financial compensation for all of this. And in 1857, John A. Macdonald wrote a legal opinion. He opined that Treaty 22 contained an express trust stipulating that all profits garnered from the sale of the lands and all land sale proceeds must be spent on behalf of the Credit River Indians. And of course, this did not happen. So I think either way, we have a valid claim here because the lands were sold, the monies were not paid to the Mississaugas, and either way, it's either these are still reserve lands and it needs to be addressed, or if the lands were sold, then the money has to be dealt with as to what happened to it all. So on May 28, 2018, the claim for Treaty 22 and for Treaty 23 was submitted to the governments of Canada and Ontario. We're in negotiations with both governments now on how to proceed. I'd like to point out that Canada in particular, and Ontario as well, are being very cooperative. One thing that we need to point out, I'm one of those people that lives on this land. The Mississaugas of the Credit are not seeking title to any lands currently owned by businesses or residents of Oakville. We're not trying to displace the people that live here. We're not trying to displace the businesses and the owners. We understand that two wrongs don't make a right, and essentially this will be dealt with by way of financial compensation and perhaps the land elsewhere. There is some Crown land here, some municipal lands that are owned that we may be able to secure, but primarily I think this will be a money claim. And miigwech, which means thank you. That's my presentation. And I'll see if I can stop my share now and open her up to some questions.
All right, let me see if I can, everybody can unmute now.
Yeah, I could start by answering some of the questions that Stan sent in. Okay, well, the first question he was or wanted me to comment on is the English interpreters gave false translations to the Aboriginal leaders. So the British came to the Mississaugas and said, look, we've got all these people down in the United States. They're going to relocate up here. It's going to be a good thing for you. They'll have some farms. You can sell goods to them. You'll be able to hunt and trap on the riverlands, and everything's going to be fine. Or that they were paid, the Mississaugas understood themselves to have been paid so that the British could share the land with settlers. They would, if you show the chiefs back in the 1800s what GTA looks like today, they'd be appalled. It was like, if they saw this tsunami of white people coming, I don't think they ever would have signed these treaties. That's not what they understood.